Bibles and open with me to 1 Samuel chapter 18. 1 Samuel chapter 18. We'll be looking at the entire chapter this morning as we continue looking at the life of David from God's Word in 1 and 2 Samuel, walking through these two books of the Bible. We'll make it. As you're turning there, just ponder this question as you think about your life and even how God works in ways that sometimes are good, but we don't like it. You ever had that before? Think about this question. How do you respond to others who are more successful than you? That is a difficult question to ponder, even harder to answer. How do you respond to others who are more successful than you? In life, there are many polarizing things. I do not like lima beans. Does anybody like lima beans? How many love lima beans? I hate lima beans. How many of you like pickled beets? I can't stand beets, right? How many of you like squash? I can't stand squash, right? These are polarizing things, right? And there are many, many others. If you're noticing a trend, it's vegetables. That's the trend here. Many other foods and vegetables that are very polarizing. Then you think about people. There are some people, some characters that are very polarizing. I'm not going to name names. But there's some people that some people love and others loathe, right? But we'll just leave it right there. We're going to look at a chapter of Scripture today that comes across in a similar fashion, a polarizing character. Some people love, in fact, most everybody loves. And then some person utterly hates and detests. But we're going to come back to that question. How do you respond to others who are more successful than you? As we have been walking through 1 Samuel, the big picture theme in these two books really centers on God as the king of every person's heart, which means he has a rightful claim on all of your affections and your desires. He is the one who can literally tell you what to do. The question is, do you follow him as your king? Or are you much like Israel who wants something else? God, you're not cutting it for me. I want a king of my own making, just like the nations around me. And as we have worked our way through seeing the undulations of the nation of Israel and Eli and his sons and Samuel and even Samuel's sons, and then leading up to Saul, nobody's perfect. And as you look at this story, even David, as we'll see later on, nobody's perfect. All of this is moving towards the perfect king, Jesus Christ. We're not always going to dovetail with thinking about Jesus in this regard, but don't let this escape you, that all of this is leading to the perfect Messiah, Jesus Christ, the King who is perfect in all his ways. He is the King that has come and is coming again. And David, in one sense, is just prepping for the way and when he comes. So as we look at this passage today, think again of the question, how do you respond to others who are more successful than you? And I'm not even going to be specific yet. There are so many different ways that we can look at other people and we can just get rubbed a little raw. Why does that happen to them and not to me? You ever wondered that before? Why do they get all of that and I do not? And so we can get rubbed a little raw when we look at others and we begin comparing ourselves to other people. So let's just jump right into the text as we start in chapter 18. Start right away in verse 1. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. We'll just stop there for just a moment as you look at verse 1. The he, right away, is David. This comes right on the heels of chapter 17, and you remember chapter 17, that glorious chapter, that famous chapter of little boy David conquering the mighty giant Goliath. We looked at that a couple weeks ago. And though Sunday school lessons typically would emphasize you too can slay your giants in your life, as long as you pick up those 5 smooth stones, you're good to go. That's not the point of the chapter. The point of the chapter is nobody in Israel cared for the reputation of God like David did. That's the point. Saul, who was commissioned by Israel to fight Israel's battles and to be the man who represents them, he was cowering his tent. It was the boy David, likely around 16 or 17 years old, who said, "Is anybody going to defend the reputation of God?" And he is the only one who does. God gives him a mighty victory. He cuts off Goliath's head. He didn't have a sword. He goes to Goliath with his sling, his stone, and he tells the giant, "I'm going to cut off your head." What great faith David had. He cuts off the giant's head. He brings it to Saul at the end of chapter 17. Saul inquires, whose son is he? He knows who David is, but whose son is he? Because he has made a promise. The man who takes care of the giant is the man who I will give my daughter to in marriage, is the man I will give untold riches to, is the man I will give his family tax-free living, right? I want to know who his family is. Whose son is he? But really that stands as the question of the whole chapter. Who? Who is the one who will take the reproach away from Israel? David said, "I will be that one. Nobody else would." So in the end, David was the one who cared most about the reputation of God. Not Saul, not even the armies of Israel. And so don't quickly move on to chapter 18 as its own discrete story. It follows right on the heels. In one sense, and we're not going to trace all of the different ways in which this happens, chapter 18 becomes a mirror image of chapter 17. Later on, maybe this afternoon or this week, walk through both of them together, and you will see there is this eerie mirror image of Saul compared to Goliath. Fascinating. But jumping into chapter 18, verse 1, it is David who, when he is done speaking to Saul, "I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. I'm that one." We find out a few things would have happened just right after this. David has just killed Goliath. He's come back to Saul's tent. He's told Saul who his family is, whose son he belongs to. And then we are told this: the soul of Jonathan was knit to David, and Saul took him that day and would not let him return. So two things happen right away. Number one, Jonathan, Saul's son, whom we've seen a little bit of Jonathan early on, chapter 13, chapter 14. We often get the impression that Jonathan and David are just boyhood friends. That would not be accurate with the text. Jonathan had a close relationship with David because he initiated it, but Jonathan is likely in his upper 40s or low 50s. So this isn't just two boyhood friends. David is not even 20, and Jonathan is likely in his upper 40s, early 50s, and Jonathan sees something about David. He is watching this whole scenario unfold with the giant. He is watching his dad respond the way he's responding. He's watching the armies of Israel respond the way they're responding. And he sees David come back with victory. And it says his soul knit, bonded together. Anybody use J.B. Weld before or anything like that? This is like Gorilla Glue, so tight. He bonded right to David, the soul of David. We're going to see a little bit more about that in just a moment. And then Saul says, "I don't want you to go back and forth anymore from your father to me, back and forth. I'm going to keep you all for myself." So Saul said, "I'm going to have you stay with me, and you're not going to return to your father." Jumping back into the text, verse 3 continues, "Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants." The narrator, God's word tells us further about Jonathan's love for David. What he does, he makes a covenant with David. What is a covenant? A covenant is not simply a promise. It's not simply an agreement. It is a solemn vow. I commit myself to you to such a degree, and this was typical with covenants. Remember, even when Abraham and God are talking, God makes a covenant with Abraham, and he has Abraham cut the pieces of the animal apart and walk between the pieces of the animal. The symbolism is this: We are making an agreement one with the other to such a degree that if one of us breaks this agreement, may this happen to us. We are cut in pieces. So the bond between these two men is incredibly strong. Jonathan makes this covenant with David, and he strips himself of his royal robe, his armor, his sword, his bow, and he gives it to David. This is an incredible moment in Jonathan and David's life, but I do want to take just a moment and say we must be very careful that we understand what this is not talking about. And we'll see this even later on in chapters 19 and 20. This is not, as some have suggested, some kind of homosexual relationship between the two. Get that out of your mind right away. There is nothing in the text to suggest that at all. Many people look at this and even David's strong relationship with Jonathan as a beautiful example of such a relationship, and that's not true. There's nothing in the text that suggests that at all. And such practice, even beside that, is completely against God's law. Completely against God's law. And David is said to be a man after God's own heart. How could God say that about David, and yet David engage in something that is a violation of God's own law? That's preposterous. It is, in one sense, blasphemy to suggest that. And even beyond that, the text would say, for it is not shy to tell us about David's sins. It is very strong to say that David is not perfect, and he is a sinner. We'll see that in 2 Samuel. He is a sinner, but it has no reference at all that this was a sin on David's part or Jonathan's part. So be very clear on this, that this is not a bad relationship. This is a beautiful friendship, a perfectly holy friendship. There's more to this text than friendship, but it's not less than that. There is something to be said here for the way Jonathan and David engaged their friendship. So what is this, though, as we look at Jonathan and David and their relationship? This really highlights Jonathan's noble character. A man who likely is in his upper 40s. He is the crowned prince of Israel. We sometimes struggle with relating to people like this because I don't have that. We don't have the crown prince idea here in America. So we struggle even to relate to this and compare our situation with theirs. But think about what Jonathan was promised because his dad was king. You're going to be the next king. You're going to be the next king of Israel. That is what Jonathan should have had coming to him, right? And yet what Jonathan does here, even before everything is said and done with David and his dad, Jonathan recognizes God's hand on David. And notice what he does. He strips himself of his robe, that is his royal robe, his princely garment. He strips himself of his armor, his sword. Remember, he and his dad, the only two to have swords in Israel at this time, strips himself of his sword, his bow, and he gives it to David. This is nothing short of him saying, David, I submit to you as my king. I give up whatever sort of privilege that I should have had because of being the crown prince. And I recognize that you are the rightful king. I give it to you. This is astonishing. Who in their right mind would do this? Would give up privilege like this, give up position like this, and honor a man that you recognize God's hand is on him. Astonishing, noble character of Jonathan as he recognizes this. And his dad is out to lunch in all of this. His dad is, and we've seen that already up to this point. So as Jonathan covenants himself with David, and he gives himself to David and says, I am committed to your success. That's what he's saying. Notice what the text says in verse 5. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. You know, think about Jonathan. David ended up being very successful. Jonathan commits himself to that end, to make David successful. When Jonathan could have been moping in his tent, God, why have you done this to me? I've been faithful to you. I have done valiantly for you. My dad, in one sense, is a loser, but I have tried to commit myself to you. Why would you have this happen to me? But isn't that the case in life? Sometimes because of the actions of other people, our success might be aborted. Because of the actions of others, we might bear some of their consequences. God is bigger than all of that. And Jonathan does not have a pity party for himself. He says, no, I recognize the hand of God and I'm all in. Let me help David be successful. And David is successful. In all of Israel, we're going to see in just a little bit, all Israel, all Judah loves him. Saul recognizes his success and says, I'm going to set you over some men of war. You can command them. So we get into verse 6. As they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, note how the writer puts it, the Philistine, Goliath, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with songs of joy, with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated, Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Great little ditty, isn't it? You can imagine the war party coming back, the army coming back from their campaign against the Philistines. They're hitting towns and cities along the way on their way back. And the women come out and they're singing. They've heard by now the great victory. And they compose this song about the success of David and Saul. Do you think this is great stuff? But does everybody respond with great joy? Does everybody respond with great enthusiasm over the great victory that God has wrought? The rest of this chapter presents a very interesting perspective on the inner life of Saul. The rest of this chapter is really the inner turmoil of this man whom God has left a long time ago. So verse 8, and Saul was very angry. The English does not convey the depth of his anger here. He was fuming angry over this. This saying displeased him terribly. He said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands. What more can he have but the kingdom? As we look at the text, it's likely he did not verbalize this to many people. This was the inner thought of his heart. What more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day on. Maybe in our vernacular we could say he gave him the stink eye. He looked at him with great suspicion the rest of his days. Now this is the question that we must ask ourselves. Who are we more prone to be like? Jonathan or Saul? Have you looked at anybody else like Saul looked at David? Kind of suspicious of them? They actually produce a lot of anger and displeasure in your soul. In no small part because they seem to be doing just fine, and here I am. And this was where Saul was at. He was very, very displeased. He doesn't like the song at all. He was angry and displeased because of the song. The reason, because of how he thought it made him look, especially in comparison with David. Notice what he says, or he's thinking about this song. They have ascribed, given to David 10,000s, and they've only given to me thousands. This is one of comparison. Mark this down. When we are sorely displeased and give other people the stink eye, probably at the heart is unwarranted comparison with them. Ponder that well, and we'll see that unfold in the life of Saul as we continue on in this chapter. He eyed David with great suspicion from now on, and things can go sour so fast. Sour so fast. Verse 10 and 11, the next day, a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul. You remember that from chapter 16. He raved within his house while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. Saul had his spear in hand. Again, a little brief echo of the spear that Goliath had in his hand. And he had his spear in hand, and he hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David evaded him twice. Now, David becomes, in one sense, the passive character in this whole chapter. You wonder what David was thinking about all of this. Here's the stark raving mad man, and he's trying to pin me to the wall with his spear, not once, but twice. In God's good providence and protection, David's life is spared, and we know that that is God's hand on him. See, don't be surprised if not everybody is a fan of your successes. Don't be surprised if even the greatest pain hits very close to home. Such was the case with David. Such was the case with Jonathan even. So Saul is raving mad, and he tries to kill David, and David eludes him. We aren't told all the particulars about that, but he does. Jump back into verse 12. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. So Saul removed him from his presence and made him a commander of 1,000. Note the irony there. We'll get back to that in just a moment. He went out and came in before the people, and David had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. When Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in fearful awe of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before him. That phrase, he went out and came in, is the typical phrase that was used of the kings to go out and fight the battles for the nations. And now it's used of David. He is the one who is functioning really as the good king of Israel, not Saul. So David evades Saul. He gets away. And notice what Saul does. He removes him from his presence. When you are irritated with somebody, when you cannot stand their success, their very presence chills you to the bones, and you want to get rid of them. So you ignore them. You remove them from your sight. And that is such typical practice among human beings. Saul removed him, and then he even demoted him in his military position. Saul is the one who had given David the position over commanding troops. And now Saul is the one who said, I can't stand it. I'm going to make him the commander of thousands, not 10,000s. Because they were singing about 10,000, so I'm going to make him the commander of thousands. The lunacy, if you were to think about Saul, the lunacy that he would do this. But our hearts are not very far from even Saul himself. What would bring David to this point? You notice the text is very clear. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. This is the beating heart of the entire chapter. God was with David. He was not with Saul. God was with David. We'll come back again to that later on. But Saul is greatly afraid of David. So as we work our way to this point, what's the first thing we notice? The basic facts. First point today is Jonathan, Saul's own son, loved David covenantally, but Saul was intimidated by him. Notice the contrast between those two. Jonathan loved David covenantally. He bound himself to David. It wasn't just a flippant, I love you, but he said, I am committed to you to such an extent that if I break this bond, may this be done to me. I'm cut in pieces. But Saul was intimidated by him. The comparison between Jonathan and Saul is astounding. Jonathan, the crown prince, is the one who says, I will strip myself of my royalty and give them to you. And Saul is the one who said, what more is there for him to have but the kingdom? I want to clutch and cling to that kingdom. The difference between the two, very strong. But let's go on as we continue on in this narrative, this story, verse 17. Then Saul said to David, here is my elder daughter Merab. I will give her to you for a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battle. Now just pause there for just a moment. Saul is reneging on his promise. David already earned this privilege. And yet Saul, because of his displeasure and his angst against David, he has to say, well, here's another way that you can have this. Fight my battles, fight the Lord's battles for him. For Saul thought, let not my hand be against him. Yeah, he's been foiled in his attempts so far. Let not my hand be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him. And David said to Saul, who am I and who are my relatives, my father's clan in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king? The nobility of David in this moment. But at that time, when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, she was given to Adriel the Maholathite for a wife. Notice the scheming of Saul. What scheming of his? He failed to kill David himself, so why not strategize to have somebody else do it, right? When Jesus is talking to the disciples and by subsequent leanings to the religious leaders, he says, you think that murder is an action. Murder actually is a disposition of your heart against somebody else. You think it's wrong to murder, and it is. But I tell you, if you hate a man in your heart, you have murdered him. The disposition of Saul that he would be such against David, foiled in his own attempts to personally kill him, that he's going to have somebody else do it. So the rest of this chapter is devoted to him strategizing, scheming. How can I have somebody else, the Philistines, how can I have them kill David for me? And who better? The Philistines, right? And he uses the love and affection of his own daughters, the love and affection of even David for his daughter. But even the humility of David to say, who am I? I'm just a lowly little servant. Who am I to be a son-in-law to the king? Isn't that what he says? Who am I? Who are my relatives, my father's clan, that I should be a son-in-law to the king? I'm a nobody. I'm just from Bethlehem, least among the children of Israel. The humility of David. But even though David could have pressed the point, Saul, you've already promised me this, just give it to me, I've earned the right already, David doesn't press that. So we go on. After a time, Merab is not given to David for one reason or the other. Verse 20, now Saul's daughter Michal loved David. Again, the theme, Jonathan, his own son, loved David. Michal, his own daughter, loved David. What's up with Saul? He doesn't love David. And they told Saul that Michal loved David, and the thing pleased him. Notice the affections of his heart. He's not pleased because this is, oh great, now we get to marry off my daughter. No, he's pleased because now his daughter can be a snare for David. Saul thought, let me give her to him that she may be a snare for him and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Therefore, Saul said to David a second time, you shall now be my son-in-law. Forget this whole waging battles and all this kind of stuff. No, just be my son-in-law. And Saul commanded his servants, speak to David in private and say, behold, the king has delight in you. The deceit and the lies that Saul goes to. And all his servants love you. Now then become the king's son-in-law. And Saul's servant spoke these words in the ears of David, and David said, does it seem to you a little thing to become the king's son-in-law, since I am a poor man and have no reputation? Note again the humility of David. He sees himself properly. Who am I? This isn't a little thing. It's a huge thing that I would be brought into the king's family. In one sense, I would become a part of the heirs of this whole family. Who am I? I'm a poor man. Whereas Saul's family was wealthy. We read that earlier in chapter 9. I am a poor man and I have no reputation. So David's response is very noble. Saul has to continue to scheme. And so in verse 24, the servants of Saul told him, thus and so did David speak. Then Saul said, thus shall you say to David, this third time, the king desires no bride price except 100 foreskins of the Philistines, that he may be avenged of the king's enemies. Now Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. And when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law. So this progression unfolds. David, I want you to marry my daughter, be my son-in-law, and you can avenge our battles. You can take on the Lord's battles for us. David says, no, who am I? I'm not one. I'm not a one of reputation. I'm a small man. Saul comes back to him and said, what about Michal? Marry Michal, and you can be my son-in-law. I have great delight in you. And David says, no, no, no. And then Saul comes back a third time, and he says, okay, if it's kind of an issue of earning, so to speak, the right, here's what you can do. And this is a bit awkward. You look at the text, and here is the commission. I commission the dowry for you to marry my daughter 100 Philistine foreskins. This is, you can chuckle, this is a bit odd, a bit grotesque, a bit awkward to say the least. And the thing pleased David. Now, not the action, but the opportunity to have a bride price, so to speak, and to be his son-in-law. So, the text is very clear on what David does. He goes out and he kills not just 100 Philistines. He kills 200. Notice what the text says in verse 26. Before the time had expired, David arose and went along with his men and killed 200 of the Philistines. And David brought their foreskins, a little bit gruesome, I might say, brought their foreskins, which were given in full number to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. Again, the mirror image of chapter 17 is amazing. David is the one who went out and cut off the head of the one who was the reproach of Israel, and he brought the head to Saul. David is the one who's commissioned here to go cut off 100 Philistines, and he brings them to Saul. Lots going on in this text. We're going to continue and then wrap this up together. Verse 28. When Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, Saul was even more afraid of David. So Saul was David's enemy continually. Then the princes of the Philistines came out to battle, and as often as they came out, David had more success than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was highly esteemed. And so here we come to the second point, obvious facts in the text. Saul was against David continually, but he was esteemed by Israel. David said, I have no reputation, yet in the end of this story, David is the one whose name is lifted high, greatly esteemed by all Israel and all Judah. They love him. They love him. Again, this story doesn't stand on its own. It's connected with the broader storyline of what we've been seeing in 1 Samuel and what will continue on. It would be relatively easy, and some preachers have done this, to think that the theme of this text is friendship or success or fear. Those aren't the main themes of this text. And the main theme isn't awkwardness either, okay? Don't think that it is. What is the main theme of this chapter? The central theme here is responding to the success of somebody else. That's the main theme. You have Jonathan in his response to David in his success, and you have Saul in his response to David and his success. The question is, when you see the work of God in and through somebody else, whether or not it results in success like this is beside the point. How do you respond? Like Jonathan or like Saul? How do you respond when you see this success? Let's unpack this just a little bit more. Everybody loves David except Saul. David is successful in everything he does, but not Saul. Even Saul's attempts at killing David fail miserably. At every point, Saul is stymied by David. You can imagine, you almost even feel for him a little bit that he tries this and stopped cold. He tries this and foiled. Everything he does, it just fails. And so he's every single day reminded at his failure, but somebody else's success. Let's keep going with this. The reason we are told is that God is with David, but not with Saul, which again is the heart of this very chapter. What does it mean that God is with David? Don't read this text. Please don't focus on the success of David without realizing how he got there. Please don't focus on Saul's non-success without realizing how he got there. Again, this all goes together in the storyline. The reason why David has success is because of God, not David. The focus is not, if you just be like David, you can be successful like this too. That's not the point. We're going to come quickly into chapter 19 and 20 when success is very different for David. The point is God is with David because David is with God. That's the point. Back in chapter 16, chapter 17, David has been with God. Saul had not been. I would venture to even say it's doubtful if Saul ever was with God. And so God was patient with Saul, gave him second and third and fourth chances, opportunities, and yet Saul, we have seen time and time again, refused God, rejected God's word, dishonored God's commands time and time and time again. What we're seeing in chapter 18 is the consequence of all of that. You leave the success with God, but are you committed to being with God no matter what? Saul was not. David was. Notice Saul's progression throughout this whole text. He was angry and displeased. Why? Because he drew his own conclusions. How many times do we draw our own conclusions? The ladies are singing about this because they must think I'm worthless. Whoever said that? They're just rejoicing over the victory that Israel had won. He drew his own conclusions, which meant what? That he was now jealous and felt threatened. He eyed David from that point on. He tried to kill him personally. He removed him from his presence. He demoted his military position. He privately schemed for others to kill him. He delighted in the prospect of his plans working out. But in the end, he was ultimately riddled with fear because of David. If anybody could maybe have some measure of fear of David, it's Jonathan. And yet Jonathan is the one who said, David, have it all. I'm with you, man. God is with you. I am with you. I want you to be successful. But not Saul. He is riddled with fear from that day on, completely fearful. What the text tells us he knew, and this is an astonishing thing, he knew that God was with David and not with him. You know what you call it when you know something to be true, yet you fight against it every step of the way? It's arrogance. That's what that is. He knew that God was with David and not with him. He knew that the kingdom had been taken from him and had given to a neighbor of his instead. He knew that none of God's plans can be overturned, but his could, and yet he still tried. This is pride. He knew all this, and he still tried to go. Plain and simple, this is arrogance and pride. Trying to keep what God had already said no to, his kingdom. Trying to get rid of what God had already said yes to, that is David. He knew all this, and he still fought against it. The arrogance in man fights tooth and nail the plan of God, even though you know you will never win. Who does that sound like? Is that not the evil one? He knows he's not going to win. And yet, for thousands of years, he has constantly tried to thwart God's plans. But it's not just arrogance. As we've already noted briefly, this is jealousy or envy. It is all about his kingdom, maintaining a hold of his kingdom, not letting go, not wanting anyone else to have it. That's envy. And here we're not going to make a sharp distinction between covetousness and jealousy and envy, but this is what's going on in the heart of Saul. He is envious over David. And even at the heart of all of this is the issue of reputation, glory, or fame, meaning this: what are you most concerned about? Your own reputation or the reputation of God? Your own glory or the glory of God? That is at the heart, beating at the center of this. Saul, he was most concerned about himself. He was most concerned about his reputation. He was most concerned about his own glory, his own fame. So he tried to maintain his kingdom at all costs. He is most concerned with Saul, not with God. But we know this. And this is where it is crucial to follow the trail of your emotions, which normally reveal other things going on in your heart. So follow the trail. Don't just be content to say, oh, I got angry over this, or I was displeased about this action by this person. Follow the trail back, and you know where it will lead? All the way back to your heart in its greatest desire for glory. That's where it will go. If you are angry over the success of somebody else, in one sense, no matter who they are, track that anger all the way back to the source. And it's because you are more concerned with your glory than the glory of God. Jonathan, he didn't have this anger. He didn't have this great displeasure because he was most concerned about somebody else's glory than his own. In the case of Saul, envy will always be tethered to your real treasures. Always. Always tethered. The path that your envy takes will always follow the nature of your real treasure. So in the case of Saul, the real treasure was himself, and so he was motivated by self-interest and self-preservation. That was the result. And when your treasure is no bigger than you, it is bound to very easily be threatened. When your treasure is no bigger than the glory of your own head and ego, you will be constantly looking over your shoulder at somebody who's going to be threatening that. But when your glory is actually God himself, It's so much bigger than you, isn't it? He's so much bigger than you. When the glory of God is what matters most to you, his reputation, his fame, then you will have no problem sacrificing your good and your goods for his glory. That's Jonathan. He had no problem sacrificing his good for the glory and fame of somebody else. But Saul said, I'm going to hold on to this kingdom. You're going to have to pry it from my cold, dead fingers. That is not a heart that is captured by the glory of God. That is a heart that is closed in on itself. Back in the Reformation time, Martin Luther said this about the heart of man: incurvatus si. The heart is turned in on itself. That's all we're concerned with. All we're consumed with is self. But not so with Jonathan and David. So as we bring this to a close, notice very carefully. Jonathan responded very differently than his dad did. Jonathan submitted to God's plan. He submitted to even the success of somebody else. Gave himself over to that. David, for his sake, he trusted in God. Nowhere in this text does it say that David worked hard to succeed. He just did his job. He served Saul, the man who tried to kill him. He trusted in God, and as we'll see in ensuing chapters, David had to patiently wait for God to exalt him. And isn't this where we get the heart of it? Pride and humility. Humility says, I will let God exalt me in his time and in his way. Pride says, I will take it whenever I jolly well please, however I please. Such is the heart of Saul. May God work in each one of us so we are not like Saul, but more like Jonathan and even like David. Father, thank you for your goodness to us. You have blessed us in ways that we can't even begin to imagine. You are a kind God. Help us, Lord, to think carefully about these things. It is, in one sense, just a story, and that there are a bunch of other stories to come. But, Father, may the truth of this chapter press home to us. Far too often are we like Saul, in the depths of our own heart, jealous, envious over other people when they have other things happen to them that don't happen to us. Father, guard our hearts. Help us to guard our hearts with all diligence, for out of it do flow the issues of life. Be honored and glorified to work in us to this end. In Jesus' name, amen.